Florian Schulz has been living in the leap of faith zone forever, says his friend, photographer Jaime Roja. He knows what he wants to do, needs to do. With that kind of faith, there are no options. You just keep moving forward. And what is it that Florian wants to do? Nothing short of creating wildlife corridors across North America, both on land and at sea, an audacious dream, and one that could change conservation on the continent. Now, this might sound odd given the length of my time as a photo editor, but Florian was the first conservation photographer that I ever met. We first crossed paths at Wild 8 in Anchorage in 2005. It was an historic event for one particular reason. It was there that the International League of Conservation Photographers was founded. Florian was one of the biggest champions behind organizing this passionate group of photographers committed to exploring, sharing, and conserving the natural world. In many ways, he was tired of being out there by himself. Well, he wasn't completely alone. Together with his life and business partner, Emil, they had been working on the Yellowstone to Yukon project, described as a visual conservation campaign to document the efforts to preserve wildlife corridors that would link existing parks and public lands. The goal, to ensure protection of the world's largest intact ecosystem, mountain ecosystem, a 2,000-mile biosphere across the spine of the Rockies. As if that weren't ambitious enough, what they dubbed freedom to roam soon came to encompass Yukon to Yucatan and Beaufort to Baja. As I said, a little audacious. This passion for conservation, and particularly the wild places of North America, started early. Growing up in Germany, he yearned for a wilderness and keystone species that no longer existed in such a transformed landscape. As a teenager, he applied for an exchange student program, and although his essay was all about his love of the Rockies, he got shipped off to Iowa. Instead of mountains, he was surrounded by cornfields. But he made the best of it. He got a bike and spent hours exploring the Des Moines River. And although he might not have thought of it quite like this, much like Lewis and Clark on their epic journey through the very mountains that he longed for, Florian was constantly seeing species new to him. Warblers, not grizzly bears, but it still counted as a wildlife experience. As for his time in the States, it did get better. He left Iowa for New York, and when he did have a chance to finally explore those mountains, there was no turning back. Florian tells me that he has what is called the rover gene. I'm not sure if he knows this, but the gene was actually discovered in fruit flies. But there are two variants. The rover, which predicts a more adventurous approach to exploration, and the sitter variant. And sadly for his parents, Florian clearly inherited the rover variant. When not at sea or in the wilderness, he, Emil, and their two sons, Nanook and Sylvan, live in Alaska, as close to the pool of the wild as possible. His friend and editor from Mountaineering Books, Helen Chirulo, says, tenacity, patience, and his ability to relentlessly seek ways to express and surprise viewers, grounded in a deep sense of the beauty of the wild, make him one of the most extraordinary visual communicators of our time. Please welcome Florian to the Xposure stage.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much, Kathy, for getting all these little nuances about my past, put a smile on my face. Thanks, everybody, for making the time to come to this presentation. I have to say, I have to be honest, I've never been in a place that has such a high concentration of incredible photography exhibits ever, and I can't even imagine another place like that ever anywhere on Earth. Almost about 100 incredible exhibits. I'm still overwhelmed and slowly to take it in. What I want to do with this presentation, I want to keep it a little bit more on the personal side, as well as weave in some of the experiences in my conservation work, where we're trying to keep some of the last wild places in North America. It's some of these are really massive undertakings and take for many years. And so for me, it's been going back to the same places year after year. Some of the areas I've gone back to over an entire decade, and I just love it, getting to know places more. That's really a lot what my work is all about. Like for many of the other presenters today, we've heard many of these things start with childhood dreams. And I had the wonderful situation that my parents were outdoorsy. They took us out into nature a lot, and we lived close to the Alps in southern Germany. And so any opportunity to get out for me was something special. And I started even with the photography very early on. I was dreaming of the wilderness of North America, reading the books of Jack London, and because we didn't have grizzly bears and wolves, it was that dream that would eventually make me become an exchange student and come to North America. The photography was something that came natural because I wanted to be out in nature as much time as I could, and when I would come home, tell my parents or siblings or friends what I had seen out in the outdoors, they would like nod and say like, oh yeah, that's nice, but they really didn't get it, how special it was. So I eventually picked up a camera to photograph the foxes that I would see in a nearby forest, or the kingfisher that's so beautifully colorful in Germany. And once I was able to bring home images and show other people the images, that's when things started to change. And so in a way, that's how my passion for photography and later on film was born. Today, I make my living in that mix between still photography and wildlife filmmaking, and all of it really is an excuse for me to be out in the wild. That is my biggest ambition and goal, to actually be out in nature, to soak it in. And it doesn't mean that you just have to pick up shots, go somewhere and quickly, get all these photographs or film clips. For me, it's the time spent outside, the changes in the weather conditions, the animal observations I might discover. Now, on the conservation campaign side, most of it, what we did is create books at the beginning that later on would then turn into exhibits and other outreach campaigns. And that's been basically the work that I've been doing over many years. I started photographing over 35 years ago, and it's been about 15 years that I got into the film side. As soon as the first high quality cinema cameras came out, digital cinema cameras. And so anyway, I thought what I'd do today is in the beginning of my presentation, just take you along a little bit on one or the other adventure. And one of the most adventurous things that I've done, actually in collaboration with Kathy too, is work on polar bears in the high Arctic. And it was at a time when not many people had gone out to photograph polar bears in a way of like out on the sea ice, camping in tents and so on. And so that was like over 13, 14 years ago when I started that. And so for me, what I loved about that challenge is that everything was completely new, and especially getting into an area where, there was just predominantly nature, and in this case, a very cold environment. But for me, that was the most exciting thing I could imagine. Kathy already mentioned that I work with my wife, and that can be a blessing, and sometimes it can be also a challenge, or you have to be careful what all you get your partner into and what kind of trouble you might be getting into. But Emil, when I told her that when we were going to start this project, it took a little bit convincing, because I wanted to get into the high Arctic even during the cold time of the year. And Emil's from Mexico, and so for explaining to a Mexican to go into the high Arctic was not the easiest thing to do. But what was really interesting is that at the beginning, she wasn't sure if she wanted to do it. And at the end, when we were working on this story and on this project, she was so tough, and she withstood any of these challenges, that it was actually harder for me than I couldn't complain because she wasn't. So when I got really cold, I couldn't really be pitting myself or anything. And I think in a way that serves to anybody that thinks oh, I can never do this. She put her mind to it, and she was able to do it, and she just mastered it just as well as as anybody could. We were on our way out into the polar bear country, and I can tell you that something really changes if you suddenly see the fresh tracks of a polar bear. Suddenly your eyes look all around, you study every little detail in the landscape, because we're literally out there just with a snowmobile. We're sleeping in tents, and that presence of that top predator, the presence of a polar bear, just changes some things. And that feeling is probably some of that grounding feeling that Sandesh was talking to about earlier. And we had to be meticulous about the equipment we had along. We were just on our own. And so what one has to imagine that when you go out into polar bear country like this and camp out there, everything revolves around a tiny little cook stove and a tent. If a storm would blow away their tents, right away it becomes a survival situation. If your little stove doesn't work, suddenly you don't have water to drink, and you can't make any hot water bottle to put into your sleeping bags. And so all of these, this mix of adventure, challenges, and possibly finding these animals, that is what I really loved. Here, early on in the trip, suddenly that little stove wasn't working, and I had to figure out how to just clean it out from all the soot that had been building up. And again, the basis of all the time being out there is to be able to melt snow and ice, to even have drinking water. And so all of these are really, challenges that one has to overcome. But then there's the search for the actual polar bears. When you sleep out in a tent, it's of course another danger that you could suddenly be surprised by a polar bear when you're just resting. And so we had to actually take turns polar bear guarding, but I'll tell a little bit more about that in just a moment. We would regularly climb onto these frozen icebergs that were frozen into the ocean ice. And from these vantage points, we would glass the surrounding areas. But I can tell you one thing, to find a white bear in a white landscape is not all that easy. Most of the time, we would move on, we would not see any bears, and the search would continue. Many kilometers we would traverse into different fjords along the Svalbard archipelago, and then every night we would find a new location where we put up shelter. Every day the same routine, melting snow and ice. And then we had to take turns polar bear guarding. That means one of us would sleep in the tent, and then the other person would be outside watching the surroundings, that we wouldn't suddenly get surprised by a polar bear. And then from one moment to the other, the weather changes, complete whiteout conditions like you see here. The same thing again, you stare out into the white, that atmosphere that there could be a polar bear out there just overtakes you. And when it's really white and white like this, your eyes also start to play tricks with you. You stare into one area and it might just be like a piece of ice frozen into the sea ice, and you're thinking, is this a shape? Did this just move? And you start staring really intensely, and the longer you look into one area, the more you're convinced that something did just move. And what you have to imagine that in a situation like this is when we encounter our first bears. Just like ghosts behind a curtain of snow. Here you can actually see the size difference. the male really seems to be twice the size of her. That's why we thought it was a cub at the first moment. And as they were coming closer, we realized it was actually a mating pair, where the male always circled the female. So on the one hand, of course, you're really excited. You're out there for so many days to actually find bears. And then when you finally find them, you're kind of wondering, wow, what are these bears going to do? You know, how close are these bears going to get? And so it's a mix with excitement and then, of course, a certain nervousness. And in this moment, I have the feeling that the one bear goes and turns to the other, hey, let's check out the photographer over there. And then they're coming our way.
Hey! That's enough.
Yeah, I'm trying to keep the bear away with the boys, like shouting really loud, like I would know from doing that with grizzly bears on the coast in Alaska, and the bears normally would stop and slow down. These polar bears, yeah, they don't really have a lot of fear, but at the same time, I was really lucky because this big male had more important things on his mind than us on the sea ice. It was the mating season, and he was really just after this female. He followed her the entire time, and this went on for actually several days. We saw the male and female out on the sea ice, and the male would just literally just follow a few steps behind for days on end. And she was really tired of that, I think. She just didn't like the guy for the moment and didn't want to have anything to do with him. And we would see this go on. She would run away, and then he just gradually would catch up again and then eventually turn around and try to face him off. And there was little chance that she had, you know, this male was probably twice the weight and a massive bear. This still kept going for another day or two, and maybe eventually she must have changed her mind a little bit or something happened, but we saw that it happened at the end. And whenever I look at this picture, I'm like thinking like he's like hanging there, kind of like half asleep, like in the back. But anyway, yeah. When everything works out, then little cubs come out of the den with the mother sometime at the end of February, beginning of March, depending on which region it is in the Arctic. And we found another mother with young on this trip, and it was really special to see them. And what's so cool with the polar bear cubs like this, obviously they'd never seen a human being before, so they were like filled with curiosity. And as they're moving and following their mother behind, every so often they would just kind of stop and look back at us and just kind of had this curiosity what these two beings there were in the ice. One of my goals was to actually look at polar bears through the course of the season, so that meant also an expedition coming back on a sailboat into Spitsbergen, and that was the next adventure. We were out on several expeditions actually, some of them about a month, some of them six to 8 weeks. On this journey, we went to the northwestern corner of Spitsbergen. We had heard that fin whale had washed up the year before, and we were now curious if, after the ice was retreating, the remains of that fin whale would still be around and if it would still attract polar bears. And so when we got to the bay at the beginning, the entrance was still blocked with sea ice, so we made our way in with a little Zodiac, and indeed, polar bears were still coming back. They had remembered that location where that fin whale had been frozen into the ice, and so they were now coming in from all directions, returning to that. Mothers with cubs, big individual males. It was quite a mix of bears. I think we counted up to 14 different bears in this location. I'm of course beyond myself with excitement to now see this all happening around us. Here in the background on the right, you see just bones are pretty much left of this massive fin whale. And what I really wanted to create is an image that would connect the polar bears to the landscape. So that meant I had to work with a wide-angle lens because I wanted to have the animal as a dominant big figure in the foreground, but then still show the beautiful glaciers in the surrounding mountains. And so we had a little break at high tide. The bears would normally wander off into the hills, and there's no wood or anything to screws into it, so I had to actually tape this camera box to a rock. I had a remote trigger on it. Very quickly we had to leave again, and now I was just keeping my fingers crossed, hoping that something good would happen. And indeed, one of the big males came back. He realized something was different, he was curious, walked over, and I was clicking on my remote clicker the entire time, like click, 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 click. I was like, wow, yeah, it's right in front of it, click, 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 click. The whole time I was so excited, and when I came back to pick up the box to see what was in there, I was absolutely sure I had gotten this. This was at least 100 images, at least that.
Let's see if something turned out.
And then,
Yeah, we were too far away. We took one single picture. Oh wait. Oh no. Here's one. Holy Is it good or what? It's so amazing. I don't know what happened. I pressed reverse and it didn't show up. It was empty. Auden, come over here. Look at this. Wow! It's beautiful, like a painting. Is it?
so yeah, at the end,
These are cool too.
it was literally just 3-4 images, and you saw that transformation after being out for weeks, streaming these images, dreaming them up in your mind, and then it comes all down to, did it actually work? And I just really believed it didn't. And my brother, everybody was silent because he knew, like, if this didn't work out, Florian would not talk on that boat for the next week. It would be horrible. So everybody was like hanging on to, like, oh my God, please let something be on this camera, And that relief, you saw it in my face. Like, I was so incredibly thankful, because sometimes you might be working for years, on a cover image that you dream up, and it might never work out, right? And so anyway, it did in this case, and I was really, really happy, because again, for me, it was connecting the landscape with the animals, and especially if you talk about the Arctic with polar bears. Polar bears, of course, can be an ambassador for the fight against global warming, an ambassador for people caring about climate change. They can suddenly relate to people that might otherwise not care about the topics. And so we later on did not only do the National Geographic story, but many, many other publications around the world that were interested in this. And it's really important because, we need to have relatable images, and everybody that sees this photograph will ask themselves, like, what happens to polar bears when they lose their hunting platform? What happens to them when the last bit of sea ice disappears? And so these were the kind of images that I really wanted to take as well, to communicate what it actually means to polar bears that suddenly have to swim for hundreds of miles. One of the longest reported cases of a polar bear mother with her cub was actually a distance of 426 miles that bear had to swim through the open ocean. And what you have to imagine is that the temperature of that water is below the freezing point in many areas. So it might be just -1 or 1.5 degrees Celsius. And that bear in this instance actually swam for 9 entire days. At the beginning, it still had the cub with it, and that cub then eventually drowned. And she herself, because it was she had a collar, so scientists really knew about that bear. They could detect that she lost in that one swim 22% of her body weight. So if you imagine that, a bear like that loses so much of the energy, and then later on has to also go back through a summer where that bear doesn't have a lot of opportunity to catch seals and gain fat again. So yeah, global warming is real, and we're seeing the signs everywhere. Of course, not only in the Arctic. In the Arctic, however, we see global temperatures rise at twice to even 3 times the speed. And just a quick insight, we have here 1984, always the sea ice minimum, and then we compare it to 2012, and then I think I have another one, 2016, and now if we look at that, so these are actually, there used to be calculated averages of sea ice minimum, and we're so far beyond that now, and now you see vast areas of the Arctic Ocean are now ice-free already during the summer months. And what's really unfortunate about that, of course, is that when you have an ice-free Arctic Ocean, it becomes a dark surface. So any any sunlight that hits that dark surface, of course, collects that temperature a lot, like the energy from the sun a lot more, and we have a further increase in temperature. So it's a vicious, positive, accumulative effect. So again, how do we communicate this kind of a story? So we worked with different film projects. One of my first films I was involved with was To the Arctic, an IMAX film. In this one, I did not do the filming, but I was part of the team. I did the accompanying book. Because, even in places where, education should take care of, the spreading the knowledge about current state of the planet, it's not happening. So even in the United States, there's many people believe that climate change is not real, it's not human-made, and so on. So it's really a lot of work that needs to be done. So anyway, so that's in a way like the story around polar bears and how polar bears can be such a massive ambassador. One of the other topics that I really focused on is how we can actually do something directly for protecting an area, for working on conservation. And that's where I focused in the Arctic of Alaska. That's close to my current home now in Alaska. And that is working on conservation efforts in the Arctic Ocean of Alaska, in the Chukchi and the Beaufort Sea. And the question at the time was, would we allow oil drilling in the Arctic? And of course, it's just, you can't even think about the possibility of allowing something like this, because with the shifting of ice that gets pushed around with storms, Arctic storms in the winter and so on, like a oil spill would pretty much be inevitable. Like it would be guaranteed that sooner or later a massive oil spill would happen, and there's no means, there's no known way of cleaning up an oil spill in Arctic waters. And so anyway, is beyond that effort, one of the biggest things that I've been focusing on, and that's what I want to talk about more, is the area that we see. We don't have a pointer, but you see in the top of Alaska up there, you see that area that has a lot of light. So that's not a city or anything, that's the oil field and all the oil infrastructure. And there's only a handful of native communities between Kaktovik and Nuiqsut, Utqiagvik, and then Point Ley, Point Wainwright, and then Point Hope. So there's very few communities, but they're not creating that kind of massive light pollution in this area. It's actually the oil field. And the question there is, what is the future in the surrounding areas of this oil field? There's what's called the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge that's just to the east of this Prudhoe Bay oil field. And that Prudhoe Bay oil field has been exploiting the oil in this area, and over 15 billion barrels of oil have been already produced from the area. And it stretches about 100 kilometers from east to west. But what's happening now is that there's been a lot of push to expand these oil fields into some of those last remaining wild places in its surroundings. And this has been really the fight, the conservation fight in the Arctic of Alaska that's been going on for many decades. And the question is, do we want to turn what we see on the left-hand side, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, into oil infrastructure and an oil field like we see on the right-hand side? And that's been really what I've dedicated my life to over the last many years. So I started in 2014 with a specific film project on this. And my brother Salomon and I have been returning to the refuge for many years together, exploring many remote areas. And it's really another wonderful adventure because there's no roads leading into it. The size of the Arctic refuge is like the entire size of the UAE as a reference. It's a massive area, and the surrounding protected areas like national parks on the Canadian side and wildlife refuges on the south make us even a much bigger area. And since there's no roads, it's truly a wilderness that you can only get into with these tiny little bush planes, and that's what we had to do. We set up remote camps, we would raft down rivers just to get access. And the area that's mostly fought over is the coastal plain that we see here laying in front of me. And that coastal plain is also the calving grounds of the Arctic caribou, and a specific herd which is called the porcupine caribou herd. And for me, this was so meaningful because when I had that childhood dream in Germany, I was dreaming about a North America that still had bison, that still had grizzly bears, that still had wolves. And I was dreaming a lot about that, about the native people that lived in North America, that lived in a harmony with nature. And that was really something that I was so fascinated with. Once I arrived in Yellowstone on my first project where I worked on the corridors of Yellowstone to Yukon, I quickly recognized that even in North America, my childhood dream place, things weren't quite, in as good of a shape as I imagined. Grizzly bears were on the endangered species list in the lower 48. Wolves were not doing so well in the lower 48 either. That means in the United States south of the Canadian border. So anyway, when I then saw an image like this, where wild animals, just like the bison used to roam the prairies, were still roaming a plain like the coastal plain of the Arctic refuge, this gave me goosebumps. This was so meaningful because I felt I could look back into a time, into an ancient time where the balance of nature was still intact. And that was for me like one of the greatest joys. That's probably when you are here in Africa and see the wildebeest migration, what that does to you, and opportunities where we have these little windows back into a time. And I'm just going to give you some cinematic impressions of how special the caribou and the migrations are. There is music. more time I spent with caribou, the more fascinated I was with them. The capabilities to survive through the winter months, then being constantly on the move, all of that was just, for me, so incredible about the caribou. The porcupine caribou herd is about 250,000 animals. It's right now the largest herd left. When I started my work in the Arctic of Alaska, the Western Arctic herd was the biggest herd with 500,000 animals. And in just that time that I've been working on this, that population now dropped to half. So there's from the 500,000 now there's not even, there's about 200,000. So anyway, this was one of the stories that we did for the magazine on the Arctic Refuge to talk about the issues and again, trying to educate the public about what's at stake. Because during that time, there was a lot about a political movement to try to open up that very refuge with the caribou. And so I tried to do a lot of outreach, speaking for National Geographic Live and many other partners where we would tour, creating books and also film work. At the time when Obama was in office, he actually understood the importance of the Arctic Refuge, and we provided some of the little footage for him to do a TV announcement that he was trying to protect the refuge. And he actually did one of these announcements while he was just traveling, I think on Air Force One on the way to Asia.
Alaska's National Wildlife Refuge is an incredible place. Pristine, undisturbed. It supports caribou and polar bears, all manner of marine life, countless species of birds and fish, and for centuries it's supported many Alaska Native communities. But it's very fragile. And that's why I'm very proud that my Department of Interior has put forward a comprehensive plan to make sure that we're protecting the refuge and that we're
So that was all really hopeful, and we were already excited and almost celebrating, but then came the big change. Trump came into office and he had very different plans for the Arctic Refuge, and I let him speak himself for that.
One day, a friend of mine who's in the oil business called, "Is it true that you have ANWR in the bill?" I said, "I don't know. Who cares? What is that? What does that mean?" He said, "Well, you know, Reagan tried. Every single president tried, and not one president was successful." I said, "You got to be kidding. I love it now." And after that, we fought like hell to get ANWR. He talked me into it.
What the president's friend probably failed to mention is that ANWR, or the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, may hold oil, but not as much as the 9 billion barrels just discovered outside the refuge. And it definitely holds a staggering amount of life. As Florian Schulz has captured over the years, the most common creature is the caribou. And not just a few, but hundreds of thousands. The kinds of herds unseen since the plains buffalo. As they have for 10,000 years, they roam down from the mountains to give birth and get relief from bugs in the coastal breeze. And when Florian is here with his family, he can't help but wonder how long it'll last.
I feel a responsibility too as a human being that we need to keep some of these places untouched. We are changing the world everywhere so fast, but why not leave a few places unspoiled?
Yeah, and that's what I truly believe, that there's so few of these gems left, and we need to figure out whatever we can to keep those areas protected. And in the case of the Arctic Refuge, it means all the different people working together. It's working with the Gwich'in people, the Gwich'in elders, and also with basically any other conservation group that cares about wilderness conservation. It's working with the media, storytelling, paintings, anything really. In order for us to get the images, and we worked by that time already on this IMAX film, I had to be out in the field many months every year over a long period of time, over 8 years it ended up being. And during that time, my children often didn't see me for many months. And so for me, it was one of the most important things to figure out a way how they could come out into the wild. And so in between, we had these beautiful periods for several weeks at a time when they could come out with us and experience this. And in one particular day, everything came together, because even though there are so many caribou in the Arctic Refuge, it doesn't mean that when you travel there that you necessarily will see them. You know, you imagine the size of this enormous wilderness, and these caribou can literally disappear in the size of this landscape. But in this one particular year, everything came together. I was out there with my family, and the big caribou herd was moving in our direction. We would see them on the horizon, just like ants. They would even change the color of the landscape. And then suddenly they came closer, and the kids became so curious. Here in the background, all these light dots, these are caribou, and they're heading our way. And the kids were like, Mom, Mama, Papa, can we go a little closer? And we're like, okay, yeah, you can go ahead. And their curiosity drove them, and they were like slowly making their way over. And I just want to show you that moment when they had their own little adventure getting close to the caribou.
Die anderen Kälber, die schauen nicht geil. Ja.
Hat's geklappt, oder wie?
Yeah, they were so excited.
Hat's geklappt? Sind die ganz nah hingekommen?
So what you have to imagine that in the Arctic during the summertime, the sun never sets. So even in midnight, the sun is above the horizon. And so we had to turn over our sleep schedule. So we would sleep in the middle of the day and we would go out at midnight. And so the kids had to adapt to that too. And they were really troopers, but by 3 a.m. in the morning, even little Sylvan, he was eventually falling asleep. But any of these moments were really definitely one of the most memorable things in my life. And it's, I think, these grounding moments where we're out in nature, whether it's somewhere in a park, if it's somewhere in a national park, or just even smelling the earth and feeling the grass in one's own backyard. I think any of these moments are really so important to connect children with that feeling for nature. And yeah, they still can't wait to go back, and we're trying to make a big effort so that the children don't grow up with the influence of the screen, so they don't have iPads or other things for playing games or anything like that, if they can talk to grandpa and grandma with it. But we're trying to figure out ways how we can keep their imagination going, their curiosity for the wild. And so anyway, that was part of the story in the IMAX film that is out in some of the big IMAX theaters connected to museums, where we really tell the story about the Arctic Refuge. We show its tremendous beauty, the diversity of life in the refuge, and the wonderful landscapes, and we show that in the course of the different seasons. I'll just show you a quick trailer for that film.
In the far north is a magical place that few have ever seen. Join National Geographic photographer Florian Schulz on a journey into a true wilderness.
What draws me here is one of the most beautiful wild places left on our planet.
This is a sanctuary of incredible diversity. The Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Experience this adventure. discover how each of us is connected to this special place. Come with us to this natural wonder, worth protecting. The Arctic, our last great wilderness. Coming soon.
The film was narrated by Princess Dadrai Johnson. She's a Gwich'in woman from originally Arctic Village, and we were filming still at the beginning of the pandemic, and weren't able to finish everything the same way we wanted, but we were able to have Princess part of the film in that way. And later on, that film went to Washington, D.C. with many of the Gwich'in elders that would come, and they could actually one of the screenings was actually at National Geographic with a lot of the community from Nuiqsut as well as from Arctic Village, and the people that came to visit DC and to also meet with politicians, they were so proud and excited to share what is their backyard, which is their land, their wild place. And so anyway, that was really, really special to bring all of that together. So often people wonder what's next. We do work also on marine areas in Mexico, and even though I'm constantly returning to Arctic places in Alaska, we've also worked quite a bit in marine protected areas as well as in the Gulf of California. And what's recently come out, maybe you guys have seen it, is the series Planet Earth 3. In the Oceans episode, one of the sequences that we created with our team was featured in that. And it took a long time to create even that just 6-7 minute sequence. And I had already worked for 4 years ahead of time to document the coastal areas of Baja California and the surrounding islands. And we have taken out the kids with us in these places as well, and we just did this last year again. What I realized now, you know, in a career like this, like you saw with the different presidents talking about the Arctic refuge, there was Obama, then came Trump, then was Biden. Biden right now, he took back some of the lease sales that happened. All of this is like, you have to be in it in the long haul, for the long haul. You have to have a lot of patience, and you have to kind of keep fighting at it. And at the same time, it eats away at you. And so in between, I have to be honest, like I was worn out, I was depressed. I couldn't believe that after decades of fighting these fights, sometimes they are still not resolved, and you just sometimes almost want to give up hope. And so one of the few ways that I realize now that I get some more strength is by realizing how amazing this planet still is and sharing that with my children as well, because through their eyes we kind of get inspired all anew, because they're so excited, they're so curious, they're so full of curiosity really, and energy and excitement. And so in order to do this work in the long run, you know, I think for me it's really important that I also understand my place within the family and how important that is to me, how important my own children are to me. And when my wife, we're homeschooling the children too, and my wife and I talk a lot about what modern society is really doing, and actually I had a discussion with Keely about it. What's often different in societies that are living closer to the land is that parents and children, they're much closer together. There's a lot more communication. There's a lot more exchange. We often shove kids off to school somewhere, never talk to them the whole day, and in the evening see them for 5 minutes or something. And so what we realize is that we want to have that time with them and explore together with them. So anyway, that's what we have been doing, and that's what will be our goal. That's what's kind of next for us, that we want to figure out that way of how we can actually do this, because we need to still be able to do this in the long run, the conservation work, and I at the same time also need to be a dad. And so that's the balance we're trying to figure out now. And anyway, I give you one last impression about how special it was just this last year when we found some of the big concentrations of the mobula rays as we were out with the boys looking for for marine life, and that was one of the sequences around the mobiles and the orcas hunting them that was in Planet Earth 3. I did that with a good friend Eric Higuera, who did a lot of the underwater work at the same time. But anyway, it's that extensive period of time out in the wild that's really keeping me going. I need that as a balance from the ever faster and crazier world, and I hope that I was able to give you a little bit of an idea what that path has meant for me over the past 20 to 30 years. I try to work in real excellence on the side of the filmmaking as well. I invested a lot of my savings, instead of actually having savings, I invested it into camera systems and to be able to go out on my own as well and create things at that highest quality that later on will be in Netflix or Apple or Planet Earth. And we want to keep doing this kind of work, but taking the time. We don't want to quickly hop around, but go back to the same places like we've done in the past. Here's the impression from the work in Baja California. Thank you very much.